Ralph. As Vasilis mentioned earlier on, I think the first panel touches really the issues that we discussed at the University of Nottingham when we introduced the discussion about competing paradigms in modern governance between democracy, the idea, the starting points, to a more realistic assessment of the great impacts that technocrats have, even within the democratic representative format. And of course, the increasing impact of the markets themselves, that they have been globalized, and we have seen that the political process has not reached a similar level of globalization, if I can use this term. As a matter of very quick introduction, and sort of to provoke perhaps a reaction from the panelists and the rest of the congregation here, I was on Tuesday at a meeting, at a hearing at the European courts in Luxembourg. Very interesting case of constitutional importance. It was the Commission, sort of a civil war, as it were. The Commission versus the Council. Now, I will not go into the details of the case, but I will make reference to a specific, what I think is a very interesting observation in the legal pleas of the Commission, yes, the pursuer in this particular case. So the counsel for the Commission said that the decision that is under attack by the Commission, the decision of the Council of Ministers, is another demonstration, another paradigm of the creeping intergovernmentalism, yes, to the European project. So, I think we can start, therefore, our first panel discussion. As Vasilis said, normally the spiel is 15 minutes of introduction, up to 15 minutes of introduction, then we'll have an open discussion afterwards. Our first panelists, we are so privileged to have Professor Renaud Dehousse from Sciences Po in Paris, starting and setting up the scenes for us. Thank you very much.
Good morning, everyone. I want to start by thanking the organizers for bringing us here. I think it's not only a pleasure because we get an opportunity to discover a beautiful part of Greece, but also it's of course a welcome opportunity to discuss problems which have been very nicely summarized, which are particularly acute in this country, of course, but according to me can be found in the rest of Europe to a different degree. So as both an academic but also as a citizen, I very much welcome the opportunity to address these issues. I will pick up your remark on intergovernmentalism right away, but I want to start from another observation, which is the following. If you want to discuss the issue of European democracy, of course, there are very many ways of doing so. You can do it a la Habermas, by discussing in broad terms what democracy may mean in a union of nation states and how exactly you can hope to form a true European demos. I spare you that. You don't need a second Habermas, and the first one is still alive and kicking. So I'd rather try and illustrate why I think what has been for some time a fairly abstract discussion is now becoming a very pressing question. I think, indeed, the tension between policies and politics, which has been mentioned in the introduction, has become so acute that the democratic problem can no longer be avoided. And it seems that somehow this idea is gaining some ground at the European level, since you may have seen that in a very bold movement, the most technocratic European Commission has actually, in a recommendation adopted at the beginning of this year, begged European parties to politicize the debate at the time of the European elections. So the question I want to address today is, okay, let's assume they will do so, which, by the way, I'm far from sure will actually happen. And living in France as I do makes me particularly cautious about what can happen, because I sense no enthusiasm for that idea in France. But let's assume it happens. Will it really suffice to bring a positive response to the well-known democratic deficit problem? I'm really not sure. And let me try and explain very briefly why. First of all, I think indeed that we have to recognize that in response to the crisis, a number of steps have been made that do significantly erode the sovereignty of members of the Eurozone. I know that the dominant mood, if you want, is of creeping intergovernmentalism, as Aris put it, or rather, as the Commission representative was quoted saying. It's a common view. Yet, I think to some extent it is a superficial view. It is a superficial view because, of course, we know that for the time being the tempo is dominated by national governments, and in particular by one of them, which is in a position to more or less dictate policy to the rest of Europe. But that will not last forever. And if you look at how this has translated into institutional terms, what do you see? You do see, according to me, a strong consolidation of the powers of supranational bodies, first of which actually is the European Commission. Look at what happened in a number of countries at the beginning of this year, when their budgets were first discussed and commented upon by the European Commission, sometimes critically. Well, with whom did the French government initiate a political dispute? Against whom did the Belgian government, which narrowly avoided being fined for badly missing its financial target, complain? Against the European Commission, not against Mrs. Merkel, even though, of course, everybody knows that the European Commission follows a line which has been imposed by Merkel. Because basically, what has happened is that Merkel, knowing that she could not be seen exerting too much influence directly onto other countries, has decided to pass the buck to the European Commission and transform it once more into a kind of whipping agent, which has now, according to the fiscal compact, the authority to punish states that do not comply with their commitments. Merkel has, of course, been, let's say, massively supported in the recent German elections. But one day she will go, sooner or later. The Commission will remain as an institution. The fiscal compact will remain as a legal document. The discipline which Merkel has imposed on her European partners will remain with a different face. This is what I want to stress. And I could mention also the important role played in addressing the crisis by the ECB, the fact that if it were to Angela Merkel, not only the Commission and the ECB would have been strengthened, but also the European Court of Justice. It's only because of David Cameron, actually, that this was spared to the Eurozone, since it was not possible to insert a strong role for the Court of Justice under the fiscal compact. But you see what I'm aiming at, namely the fact that for the time being we see much of the nation states and the national leaders, rather, on the European scene. But at the end of the day, what will remain is more powers for Brussels and Luxembourg and Frankfurt, supranational institutions. If I were the only one to say so, you might say, who cares? The fact is that 10 days ago I discovered in a rather unknown French journal a very interesting interview by a distinguished gentleman who happened to say exactly the same thing. This gentleman is still, for the time being, the president in office of the European Council, Herman Van Rompuy. He said exactly what I just told you, namely, now you see the national leaders in 5 years' time, when the crisis will be over, what will remain is a completely different picture. So basically, that's my first part. What we see is more rules-based governance controlled by supranational institutions, which comes close to the good old community method for those who want to translate it in this in those terms. Why is this problematic, with all due respect for Commission representatives? Because at the same time there is a second trend underway, which sees a consolidation of centrifugal forces in the domestic political system of a number of member countries. You know that in the classical view, basically, integration has left fairly untouched the political systems of the member countries. They don't pay much attention to European issues. They do not really debate what ought to be done at the European level. It's a thesis which has been very nicely summarized in a brilliant article by my late friend Peter Mayer. I think this, of course, was true at the time Peter was writing it. But I would argue it's increasingly less and less true. Things are changing. They are changing in various ways. They are changing because in all our countries we pay more attention, because we have to, no choice, to what goes on at the European level. We also, and when I say we, I don't only mean the 0.something% of the people who are interested basically in European policies. I mean people at large, voters at large. I mean, the degree of attention for the European Council meetings has, of course, grown immensely as a result of the crisis. But it doesn't stop there. You see also movements toward greater political integration. So you might say this brings with it positive elements. Just to illustrate what I'm saying, here I have data on discussions during the French presidential campaign of 2012, and what percentages you'll see are the attention that goes to a given topic in the campaign materials of all candidates. What you see is that Europe features very prominently in the campaign materials of all the main candidates. Incidentally, you see that the candidate who speaks most about Europe happens to be Marine Le Pen, who does not speak of Europe to say how much she loves it, but on the contrary, how much she hates it. My point, however, is another one. How can you talk about the economy, as François Hollande did, without talking implicitly about Europe? How can you talk about immigration, as Marine Le Pen or Nicolas Sarkozy did on that occasion, without talking about Europe? If you add up all these numbers of not only the times they refer to their ideal organization of Europe, but also to those policies that are strongly Europeanized, where basically no member country can on its own decide the course it intends to follow, you see that European integration is really a structured element in a campaign like the one that took place in France on that occasion. Now, I won't comment Greek politics, but it seemed to me that, at least from what I could read, at about the same time, much of the same happened in this country. That is to say that domestic elections were dominated by European issues. I would also stress that much of that took place earlier this year in Italy, as I'll try to show in a minute. But why is this a problem? I mean, if I were to stop here, I could say, well, here is democracy at work. It's taking shape. Habermas would be happy. People talk about what's going on in other countries. Yes, they do. But how do they? What do they say? This is where I'm getting a bit worried. This is where I'm getting worried, because if we have Europeanization, it's, I would argue, of a negative character. By which I mean, people, yes, talk about Europe, but those who talk most openly about Europe is to say how bad it is, how badly organized, how bad its policies are, and so on and so forth. Now, we're used to that because since there have been European elections, there have been Eurosceptic parties of various kinds. But there's another element now, which is the fact that parties which we tended to regard as government parties, that is either in government or that are likely to be called upon to govern their country next time, increasingly find it convenient to attack Europe. Again, I could quote the French example and show how François Hollande used his hostility to fiscal discipline as a major vehicle to promote his, let's say, alternative program at the time of the presidential elections. More remarkably, I could show that Nicolas Sarkozy, although for 5 years he had been claiming he was leading Europe, all of a sudden discovered that he was radically opposed to some of the policies pursued by the European Union, not least its immigration policy. Why is that? Why is it that government parties and candidates find it convenient to attack Europe? And the answer is obvious. They read opinion polls, and they know that there are more votes to be gained by opposing Europe than by supporting it. Very simple. The point, though, is that in this supply and demand system that an election is, politicians do not merely respond to what they perceive in their electorate. They also shape it. This is actually my favorite graph. That's the reason why I wanted to have a PowerPoint. Here we used a series of polls on at the time of the French 2012 campaign, trying to look at how people responded to the campaign discourses of the various candidates. And one of the questions that was asked was, how do you think one should respond to the crisis? Is it by strengthening the powers of Europe, that's the blue line, or by strengthening the powers of the national government, the red line? And you see that basically in 6 months of campaign, the gap between the two has doubled, which I take as meaning that the entire European discourse of the mildly anti-European discourse of all candidates ended up consolidating the skepticism, to put it in a very moderate manner, of the French electorate. So it's indeed a kind of vicious circle. The more politicians respond to what they perceive as skepticism or hostility to Europe in the electorate, the more the phenomenon develops. Earlier this year, there were elections in Italy. Very rapidly, I'd say, who won? Well, it's hard to say when you see the mess that's currently taking place in Italy, but clearly what is known is that the two parties that fared best during the campaign were, on the one hand, Silvio Berlusconi's Popolo della Libertà. Voters from that group appear in blue here, and the Movimento 5 Stelle of Beppe Grillo's. Basically what this shows is that in reaction to any any question you could think of that related to European integration. Those who supported these movements were more skeptical, not to say anti-European, than the average Italian voter. So once more, Euroscepticism seems to have paid. What does this mean then in terms of the democratic deficit problem? It means two things. First of all, that yes, we have to learn how to look at European elections at domestic elections in a European light. How voters express themselves on the occasion of national elections about what is being done by the European authorities. And what you see is a growing tendency, at least in Southern Europe, towards an opposition line to the fiscal austerity imposed by Brussels. What you see is also a source of worry for me, which is a new form of opposition to Europe, which takes the form no longer of Brussels bashing, but of direct attacks on other countries. And of course the Merkel bashing that has been taking place in a number of Southern European countries is in that respect problematic. If you think of the very rationale for establishing the European Union as, doing away with the interstate tensions that had plagued the continent for over a century, what I fear is that with this polarization growing, we may end up having a kind of strong polarization within the EU between, on the one hand, AAA countries, which keep thinking that fiscal austerity is a good thing. See the triumph of Angela Merkel in the recent German elections, and the so-called Club Med countries, which are a bit less happy with some reason about what's going on. And in order not to be misunderstood, I want to make clear that for me, in that respect, France is clearly a Club Med country. So don't take this as a kind of sign of contempt on my side that I'm using this. You see very well that if you accept this vision of the problem, and I conclude with this, you see very well that the response that is promoted by the European authorities is a bit short. Okay, let's have parties nominate their candidates for the top office. Let's Martin Schulz compete with Jean-Claude Juncker or Donald Tusk, you name it. At the end of the day, what difference will it make? Because yes, you may end up, and there are a great number of ifs, by the way, but okay, assume it happens, you may end up with a commission president that will be indirectly legitimated by the European vote. Yes, fine. But what will he or she do, given the kind of powers the Commission now has at its disposal? Can he really respond to what the voters say? And I say, no way. No way, because the Commission is indeed not a government. It's not organized in order to respond to anything the voters may say. The kind of powers it has, the kind of powers the Union has in the first place, the kind of instruments it has, does not allow any kind of direct response to concerns that may be voiced by voters. The Commission simply does not have big enough political resources. Think of the size of the EU budget, which is why I end up with a simple statement, which is that if you want to go along that route of politicization, democratization that has been contemplated so far, it's not enough to have an indirect election of the Commission President. You must change the distribution of powers in the EU so that tomorrow an indirectly elected Commission can, at the end of the day, pursue policies that will really respond to the requests of voters, which means a larger EU budget, different powers than those currently enjoyed by the European Commission. In other words, you can't have a European political system without another distribution of power at the EU level, which is, of course, putting the bar at a much, much higher level. And that's what I would say is problematic with this route that has been highlighted by the institutions so far. Thank you for your attention, and apologies for being a bit too long.
I think it's better to move to the next paper. Then we will have, please keep your questions for the end of the session. We have with us Mr. David Earnshaw, who is CEO of Burson-Marsteller, if I pronounce correctly. And of course, a great expert in the European politics at parliamentary level, and a visiting professor at the University at the College of Europe.
Okay, thanks. Good morning, everybody. I'm going to take a slightly different kind of approach than that taken by Professor Dehousse, but I think there's a tremendous complementarity, and I've been wondering who should have gone first, him or me. But anyway, there's definitely a complementarity about what I'm about to say. My basic argument, my thesis, is that 2014 could be different. I don't have all the answers, and I'm looking at this primarily as a practitioner, not as an academic. I'm going to take what we know about the events of next year and try and build a case that we're about to embark on a period of fundamental change which takes us in a more supranational direction. And as I said a minute ago, it is certainly complementary to what has just been said. I'm going to look at the timeline for 2014, talk a little bit about positions, process and people. I call this a jigsaw puzzle. As you look at what is about to happen in the next 18 months, the more you look at it, the bigger the jigsaw puzzle becomes. I'm going to look at some other issues around that and then try and conclude. This is a bit of crystal ball gazing, and for that I apologise. I talked about these kind of issues with somebody else this week, and it was referred to as informed speculation. So I apologise for that. This is informed speculation to some extent. However, you will see where I'm going in a minute. This is how the next 16 months appear when you draw the picture, the timeline. And as you can see, everything starts with last Sunday. I think last Sunday's election was the beginning of this process of change. I was telling the story last night over dinner, and I think it's an interesting story that in my Brussels bubble, and I confess I live in that Brussels bubble, I organised an election night special last Sunday at my office. Now, in Britain, as Gisela knows, when you have an election, you sit and watch the television until 3 o'clock in the morning and probably get drunk and watch swingometers flow from side to side. In Germany, it's all over by 6 o'clock because of the efficiency of the German electoral system. However, I invited people to my office to have an election night on Sunday afternoon. And a number of people said to me, "Oh, David, nobody will be interested on a Sunday afternoon. Are you really sure you want to provide wine for people and German beer?" 200 young people, under the age of 40-ish, came to my office to watch the German election results. And by no means were they German. And I find this interesting, that there is such an interest in German politics in the Brussels bubble. I agree that wouldn't happen in Birmingham or in Stockport or in Athens, or it might happen in Athens actually. However, the German election kicks off that process of change, and I think the fascination with events in Germany, even today at the SPD Congress, I think is important for the future. In February 2014, by February 2014 or March 2014, the European political parties will nominate candidates for President of the European Commission. admittedly, it is said there's a little bit of a reservation in the EPP. However, if one party does it, the rest will follow, and the Greens will certainly do it, and all indications are within the PES that the PES will do it. And I'll come back to the situation in the parties in a minute. But let's assume that by spring 2014, the political parties nominate a candidate to be the President of the European Commission. And then the European elections will be held 22nd to the 25th of May. My first big question is what happens on the 26th of May? What happens on Monday morning at 10 o'clock? The best answer that one has to that question is that Herman Van Rompuy makes a phone call to the candidate of the party with the largest number of seats in the European Parliament. So now let's hypothesize that Viviane Reding is the EPP candidate and Martin Schulz is the PES candidate and Guy Verhofstadt is the Liberal candidate. Let's further hypothesize that Herman Van Rompuy calls Viviane Reding and she has, let's say, 230 seats and Martin Schulz has 225 seats. So Herman calls Viviane. I'm calling upon you to try and create a majority. However, 2 hours later, another call is made. Martin Schulz rings Herman Van Rompuy. And Martin Schulz says, but Herman, you don't need to talk to Viviane anymore. I've had a discussion with Guy, and we've got the votes. This takes you into a process of coalition formation, which is exactly the same as we find in all of our member states, or certainly the vast majority of our member states. A process of coalition formation leading to an administration. We'll come to the details later, but Declaration 11 of the treaty basically calls upon the European Parliament and the President of the European Council to come together and create that process. So you see the beginnings of what would be called in a member state coalition formation. And then if you look further at my timeline, in June, for the whole of June, you have constituent meetings of European party groups. This is relevant because, of course, one of the things that will happen is that the party groups within the Parliament will change in size a little bit. Parties which are not, national parties which are not part of the PES and not part of the EPP will be attracted one way or another to the big groups. And so, for example, the Italian PD, it's not a member of the PES but is a member of the S&D, for example. And so there will be some small changes in the number of members of the big groups. So those constituent meetings of party groups could actually be more important than they've ever been. And then on the 26th, 27th of June, the European Council will formally nominate a candidate to be the President of the European Commission. Now the big question is the automaticity of the process. One member state, the British, disagrees with the idea that there should be an automaticity of the process of nomination of a President of the European Commission and his or her nomination by the European Council, that a party choice shouldn't lead to a European Council nomination. However, I would put it to you that should European party families nominate an individual to be the President of the European Commission in the spring of 2014, should they do that, it becomes exceedingly difficult by the June European Council to betray the electorate and not to choose the person who has previously been nominated. Now, I know there's a long history of betrayal in European integration. However, I think it's very difficult for national leaders to betray the electorate 6 months after having made that choice, or 4 months after having made that choice. Once nominated, that nominee for President of the European Commission, of course, has to be elected by an absolute majority of the European Parliament, hence the second July plenary session of the 14th to the 17th of July in Brussels. And of course note the treaty that if that person doesn't secure an absolute majority of votes in the European Parliament, the European Council is required to nominate a new candidate. This is very clear, a new candidate has to be nominated. So again, the model of a process of coalition formation is with which we are all familiar, because it's exactly what happens nationally applies very well in the new European institutions. And then, Think September, think the first 2 weeks of September, and confirmation hearings. Because the first thing that the new president has to do is pull together his or her team. Enter another problem. At what point does the new president, designate or elect, start to discuss with prime ministers who will be in his or her team? Will the new president, designate or elect, do it before his or her election or after his or her election? Now, I don't think anybody has the answer to this yet, and it's a fascinating little problem, because the president-elect or designate wants the support of some prime ministers and the lobbying of prime ministers of their MEPs, but equally doesn't want liabilities in his or her team like Buttiglione previously, for example. So at what point does, let's say, Martin Schulz, if it's a socialist president, at what point does Martin Schulz meet with David Cameron or with Francois Hollande or with Merkel, assuming it's not Schulz, with Merkel, to discuss who's going to be in his or her administration from those member states? Before elected by the European Parliament or after elected by the European Parliament? It's a conundrum which I don't think there's an answer to yet. However, moving on, the hearings will happen in September. October plenary session, the new Commission will be invested, and the new Commission enters office on the 1st of November. And then, fundamentally different to every member state, the head of state who has created the coalition process, who has managed the coalition process, himself changes. Herman Van Rompuy's job is also part of the coalition deal. And this is a slightly different angle from what one ever finds nationally, because of course heads of state don't change that often nationally. But Herman Van Rompuy's job is also part of the conundrum. So, moving on, you may well all be saying, well, this is not going to happen. Remember, the basic fundamental assumption is that political parties nominate candidates. Within the EPP, the party leaders are currently defining the profile of the candidate. And in November, the criteria will be agreed. The key question is whether the candidate for the EPP will be or have been a former Prime Minister. If that is the criteria, then it excludes Viviane Reding, which is the main controversial aspect of it, because she has not been a Prime Minister and yet is a leading contender for the EPP candidacy. Formal agreement at the EPP Congress in Dublin, which is relevant because another of the candidates in the EPP side is Enda Kenny, the Irish Prime Minister. The EPP are expecting 2,000 delegates at their Congress. This will be a big event, and of course equates with the idea of, is this the creation of a European demos of some kind? In the PAS, the idea of primaries has been dismissed. The member parties are now determining their own voting procedures. The nomination of candidates will be made during October, with a selection by the February PES Congress. I'll come back to the names of other personalities that are mentioned in a minute. On the Liberal side, nominations open in November. Candidatures will be made public on the 19th of December, and an online ballot of all Liberal Party members across Europe will be employed to choose the candidate. And on the Green side, the call for candidates has already been issued. National parties will express support for one of those candidates. Candidates need the support of at least 4 and a maximum of 8 of the 33 parties. And then there will be an open primary to which any European who submits to the Green values can vote. And 2 candidates will be selected, 1 man, 1 woman, to be announced in February. So the parties are moving in this direction. Like it or not, it is starting to happen. And there is a certain path dependency about this. Once the parties select a candidate, remember, it's very difficult to betray that choice. So, I would argue that the incoming Commission President is likely to be selected through a more party-based process than ever before. Now, obviously, there is some element of member state negotiation, but this will be more party-based than previously. And remember, why is Cathy Ashton the High Representative? Because she's a woman and a socialist. not really because she's British. So to some extent, this builds on a precedent of the past. The parliamentary majority will be critical. It's interesting to hypothesise about what will be the relationship between a new Commission President with a parliamentary majority for the first time. At the moment, as everybody knows, different majorities exist on different issues. For the first time, the Commission President will have a parliamentary majority which might be stable. The new Commission President will be in an exceedingly strong position to negotiate with Prime Ministers. He or she presumably will seek a much better gender balance than previously, and presumably will insist that the members of his or her team reflect to some extent the kind of values and ideas of the President. Will it be a more partisan college? Would Martin Schulz, as a socialist President of the European Commission, be able to insist with David Cameron that he gets a left-leaning conservative woman, for example? Well, all kinds of ideas are possible. Will there be more members of the European Parliament brought into the college? Viviane Reding has already said that should she be president, all commissioners should be elected to the Parliament or have been elected to the Parliament at some point, as indeed she has. Will there be a reform of the Commission, of the portfolios of the DGs? I think that would be likely. We've talked a lot about the President of the European Commission. Just remember, however, that the list of positions to be filled in 2014 is phenomenal. 751 MEPs, the President of the Commission, the team, the college, the President of the European Council, 2 Presidents of the European Parliament, the President of the Eurozone. Look at the Franco-German paper of a few months ago. There will be a permanent President of the Eurozone to replace Dijsselbloem from the end of 2014. 20 committee chairs in the Parliament. Usually committee chairs in the Parliament are not part of a Commission presidential deal. But in 2014, once you've got the cornerstone of the Commission President, will the deal go as low as committee chairs in the Parliament? It might in some cases. Political group leaders. If Schulz doesn't become the President of the Commission, presumably he becomes the leader of the Socialist group again. The Sec-Gen of the Commission and the Sec-Gen of the Parliament might both change. And then, of course, there's the President of the Constitutional Convention, who's the new Giscard, for the 2015 Constitutional Convention. And then there's the non-EU positions, NATO and UN Secretary-Generals. So 2014, I started off by saying 2014 would be different. I think clearly it will be different, if only because there's a phenomenal package deal to establish. For the European Parliament, already this is becoming a digital election campaign, and for those of us that study electioneering, the extent to which this will be digitally driven, I think, is interesting. There'll be 50% new members, as normal. The journalists talk about up to 30% anti-system protest parties. I think it's probably 100 out of 751 members will be generally in the anti-system or protest parties. Once you add together Farage, Grillo, De Wever, Le Pen, etc., you're probably not going to, plus the smaller representatives of anti-system parties in smaller countries, you're probably going to get about 100 members of the European Parliament, roughly speaking, anti-system or protest. But of course, not always with a lot in common. Presumably Farage would not be in the same group as Le Pen. So quite a collection of disconnected parties. I think the EPP and the S&D will be roughly equal, with 220, 230 seats each. The Liberals, of course, will reduce because of the loss in Germany and the loss in Britain. The Greens could come down a little bit too, as was also seen last weekend. The absolute majority in the Parliament will be very much more difficult to achieve. A grand coalition becomes very much more likely. The Commission majority, the presidential majority of the Commission President might be more stable. Committee chairs I've already mentioned. And group Secretary Generals will be and minor positions in the jigsaw too. I don't need to go through what's in the treaty, I've done that. Some of the people, and then I'll start to conclude. It's worth looking just in brief at some of the names that are mentioned. I don't think it's any longer true, perhaps, that national politicians don't seek European office. If we look at the names that are mentioned, Vivian Redding, clearly a Luxembourg politician, Katainen, the Prime Minister of Finland, Reinfeldt is occasionally mentioned on the EPP side, Grybauskaitė, the current president of Lithuania, former commissioner, now president, is mentioned on the EPP side, Barroso, and the front-runner, Enda Kenny, the current Prime Minister of Ireland. Are all the names that are mentioned in connection with the EPP candidacy for the President of the European Commission? On the Socialist side, Martin Schulz is clearly the leading candidate, but were Helle Thorning-Schmidt to throw her hat in the ring, she would be a very attractive candidate. Daughter-in-law of Neil Kinnock, for example. Zapatero, his name is sometimes mentioned, and Pascal Lamy, perhaps too old now, but nevertheless, were an acceptable face of socialism to be needed, or more acceptable than Martin Schulz, he would be clearly a candidate. And on the Liberal side, Guy Verhofstadt, a 7-year Prime Minister of Belgium, currently the leader of ALDE in the Parliament, or Anders Rasmussen for the Herman Van Rompuy replacement. National politicians, clearly. So to some extent, the national European is merging. I'll not go through the other names, but you're welcome to look at the other names of other potential position holders. Finally, last couple of ideas. There's already intense campaigning within the parties for positions on lists. You can find it on the web very easily. These are a little bit out of date because they're both British Labour Party examples, and the British Labour Party has now done its selections. But there is campaigning on the web for positions on lists already in progress. It's a more politicised process than ever before. Some other issues, maybe not for now, but for the 5 years from now. Primaries. By 2019, presumably the party families will go down the route, the road of having primaries. The Greens are already doing it this year. The manifestos will, of course, be more meaningful this time round. If you have presidential candidates, if you have a personalised election campaign, the first question that is asked is, what do you stand for? So the manifestos have to be more meaningful than previously. The campaigning is an interesting question. I'll use a British Labour Party example, but if you were the British Labour Party, do you want Martin Schulz campaigning on the streets of London? It's an interesting question, to which the answer is only if we brief him first. Or similarly, do you want Martin Schulz campaigning on the streets of Athens? It will generate new tensions and new structures, I think. Candidacies, what is the process? To some extent, the process for nomination as the presidential candidate of the European Commission is still the smoky-filled room. It's not clear what the process is. How do you make it known that you want to be a candidate? 5 years from now, I think the processes and procedures will be a lot clearer. The previous speaker already referred to the Commission's recommendation regarding the election. I think we face the prospect, thanks to the Commission's proposal, that ballot papers in many member states will include a reference to the party family that national parties are a part of. Probably not in the United Kingdom, for example, but in other countries it will. So there will be greater awareness of European party families and European parties. I wonder if by 2019 we might need a single electoral register. It's already very easy to vote in Britain on a Thursday and vote in Belgium on a Sunday. It's illegal, but it's possible. Would a single electoral register sooner or later be needed? Maybe not 5 years hence, but 10 years hence. And then, of course, it may all be a flop. This very supranational view of the potential events of 2014 may not happen. And that's is, of course, one possibility. Let me conclude. If candidates for the Commission presidency are selected in February 2014, then as I said before, I think it's very difficult to betray the electorate in June 2014. It takes you in a certain direction with a certain path dependency, which is inevitable. I think the rearguard fight, for example, by the British government against the automaticity of partisan selection by the European Council is likely to fail. Don't forget, the members of the European Council are not only representatives of member states, but also party leaders. And as party leaders, they will be making a choice in February, March 2014, which they cannot then go back on. 2014 could mark, therefore, a fundamental renewal and reform of European institutions. And the incoming Commission President would be the first with a real mandate, potentially a real manifesto, and also potentially a stable parliamentary majority. So, thank you.
What I propose is to move with our third panelist, a good friend and a very, very good colleague, Sánchez Graells, from the University of Leicester. And then I think we could start we'll open the floor for questions for all three panelists.
Thank you very much for the invitation to be here. I think I'm probably the least qualified person in the room to speak about anything I'm going to mention, so it's all my personal views, probably as just a European citizen and reasonably disinformed about these things. I would just like to grab onto three things that have been mentioned this morning and then just try to give you a bit more of a legal and maybe boring, hopefully short, view of these things. I think it's very relevant to see that the European Union is the institution, whatever we want to call it, that spends 50% on welfare in the world. I think that's a very important fact to remain in our minds. Second thing is there's a creeping intergovernmentalism, but there is also a creeping absorption of competencies by the European Commission. I think that was very clear from Professor Dehousse's account, and I fully agree with him that a more federal, more integrated way could be an option, even if it's not really on the table. And the final thing I would like to just say by way of introduction is that I would think it will all be a flop. That would be my personal view. Also because I think that this is all very fancy and very institutionally complicated design, and we're looking at 18 months for any change. I'm worried about the effectiveness of the whole thing. And speaking as an EU lawyer, and more particularly someone specialized in competition and public procurement, which are highly technical areas, what I would say is, and please don't take any offense, everything we have been discussing so far is vastly irrelevant for the day-to-day of the European Union. And I will just take the example of the provision of public services to let you know my view of how the European Commission has basically taken over without asking anyone and imposed an agenda that is not democratically discussed and it's not open to anyone for feedback or input. I think it's in everybody's mind that the failed Constitution for Europe had a very strong approach to the provision of public services. It was felt that the welfare state is the most distinctive European trait that we have in our institutions. And even if that failed, it remained in the Treaty of Lisbon. And Article 14 of the Treaty of Lisbon basically says social services is something that the European institutions will only touch very lightly and within the remain of their competencies. And basically there was a distinction between economic and non-economic services. Non-economic services were fully for the member states to regulate. And with an emphasis in Protocol 26 that it's actually for the regional and local authorities to look at the public services we need and how we provide them, how we finance them. So we don't even want them to be centralized at national level. We want them to remain close to the citizen. This is the philosophy in the treaty. Well, my friends, this is not the reality. The European Commission has been passing lots and loads of soft law instruments which don't go to the European Parliament for any reading, which are not open to any public discussion. Sometimes they publish a green paper or a white paper, but they don't really take into account the feedback as far as I follow the legislative or quasi-legislative process. And basically, in the provision of services, as part of the fiscal package, but also as part of public procurement regulations and competition rules, when the member states are looking at more creative ways of financing and providing these services, the problem that they find is that they step into the very complicated area of economic law that they did not anticipate. They said, hey, I have legislative competence, I do whatever I want. So for instance, in the UK, they came up with this brilliant authority that said, we're going to create mutuals for everything. So what we're going to do is take the public servants, make them set up a company, spin them off from the public sector, give them a contract, so they will provide the same service, it's going to be the same people, same expertise, but we will pay on a per service basis. We will not have people on our payroll, we will not be paying for real estate, it will all be privatized. Well, the problem is, once you try and do this, you need to make sure that you are not preempting competition for the granting of the contract, you need to make sure you're giving a price for the assets that is reasonable, you have to make sure that the money that they will invest in setting up this mutual is somehow obtained in transparent way, so you're not giving state aid undercover to the public servants. So it's a very complicated process, and it's a process that has been so complicated that the UK basically had to spend most of its leverage in the negotiation of the new directives for public procurement, carving out a new Article 76A in the last draft, whereby they can ring fence the contracts for a specific type of company. So basically where they can directly award the contracts to these mutuals that they want to spin off. And this is the reality of what's going on. This is something that the European Commission is not very happy with. So what the European Commission has done is publish the so-called Almunia package in 2012, whereby there were new rules for the financing of public services and their tendering. And the European Commission already flagged that should the new rules give more leeway to the member states, they will be reviewing these rules once the new directives are approved. So the European Commission is clearly wanting to impose controls and market-based solutions on how the member states provide and finance public services, despite Article 14, despite Protocol number 26, despite any other more democratically created or more constitutionally oriented mechanism on the papers. So basically the only claim I want to make this morning, and I hope to be controversial, is that nothing really matters as long as we have a technocracy in the European Commission that can, by soft law means, impose its own agenda. Whether we agree with it or not, and I'm quite in favor of the European Commission's approach, but that's a different story. So basically I think we are facing a wake-up call. So we have a too complicated, transparent and pro-democratic system that is not actually being effective. So do we want to keep window dressing, or do we want to do something effective? And now it's for you experts to please give me some thoughts. Thank you.
The identification of that particular practical issue, which is linked with the other discussions that we have already touched upon, because essentially, as you said, public services have to be paid somehow, particularly in in the Club Med countries. So the idea then we have the treaty provision, but then we have the reality of the memoranda. Right, so I would like to open the floor for questions to all three panelists. I would like to ask you to keep your interventions and questions as short as possible to allow for wider participation. Who would like to begin? Yes. Yes, please. You have.
Thanks. I have a first question response to Professor Dehousse and a small comment from you. I feel a bit worried when the problem is framed in terms of loss of national sovereignty. And I feel a bit worried because on the one hand we're sort of riding the general feeling, which is leave it alone and we can do our housekeeping better without the supranational institutions. But on the other hand, when we talk about technocrats and the chair of the ECB, who actually saved the European project by simply stating that I'm going to give supply liquidity as much as it takes in order not for the whole ship to sink. And this we have presented as a way of showing that things are decided undemocratically. Of course, national sovereignty declines, but so will economic opportunities. It's impossible to have the economic opportunities of the euro without any of the binding constraints that go with it. And it's very pleasant for the ears of the electorate to denounce, politicians at the top level or technocrats, when in reality you need to say, okay, you can be as national sovereign as you like, but you cannot use German money, simply. And so we have to combine the question of national sovereignty with opportunities for growth. You can't have all the opportunities for growth and all the bailout without some mechanism overseeing that you don't get Greek statistics all over the place. And I think that this angle is sort of left out. And the very small comment on your presentation is, we think that when we talk about public services, we're talking about the same thing basically all over Europe. This is not the case. Public services and public expenditure and social expenditure has the same headings but has a completely different meaning. In countries like Greece, you get an accumulation of privileges going to insiders, which are financed by debts accruing to the next generation. So it is not a big deal to dismantle this kind of thing. It would have been even better to put in its place something which looks more like social services, but it doesn't have the same kind of effect like dismantling a properly functioning place.
Thank you very much. Responses or more questions? Yes, exactly.
Thank you very much to the three presenters. I have three observations that I will share, and not really questions, I think. The first is, I think that came on from Dehousse presentation on that there might be a quantitative shift in more politicization, and you were talking more about the EU. I think the major issues, that's been one element of it, but it's been a qualitative shift, that where the EU was slightly multi-dimensional before, now it's just plurality. You like it or you don't like it. And that's become, and that actually also not like in Europe, leaving the euro, all the rhetoric has become viable and has become an option to say. And that was for a long time not done. I'm Dutch. That was not done in the Dutch case. The largest party now, Georgopoulos in polls, is saying that exactly. Then with regard to the feeding into the second presentation, you can feel already what I'm trying to say. Is I think it's a very positive Brussels read of what's going on domestically, because what we have to realize is EP elections are domestic elections. First and foremost, because they're not European-wide or pan-wide elections. They're not. It's the question if we're going to agree on any kind of candidates. And in these domestic arenas, I think you're going to see about 30% of anti-EU rhetoric coming through and those like parties coming through, which is going to be very hard to govern anyway in the EP. And then the question is, we're also perhaps up for a third term. Many government officials wouldn't mind seeing that because he's kind of movable. He has his own agendas, but also is also someone who is not necessarily a Lenaud type of commissioner, if you will. And then with Lenaud on the third observation, the window dressing, what you were talking about as well, is that I guess citing him, the problem I think for me still is not necessarily democratizing the EU and trying to develop that kind of stuff, but is to get the EU being integrated within domestic arenas and talking about the EU in a way that's not pro or anti, but explaining what's going on. Many people have no idea about the timeline that you just put up, have no idea about who's actually in a parliamentary group. I'm not saying that if you give people more information, we're going to like the outcome of it. that is totally up for grabs, and that's essentially democracy. But I think for now, many people have the idea, and maybe rightfully so, that whatever they vote in EP elections is not going to matter. Because you're going to have some technocratic group of people, or you're going to have indirect, legitimized a government official in the council going on. And that to me, I think, is the true problem of any form of supranational democracy in Brussels.
The interesting thing about this whole democratic deficit issue, this It's not because I disagree with you, but it's sort of something I've been trying to get my head around for the last, whatever, year and a half or so since the crisis, is that it's usually couched in terms of, is there a European demos that you can mobilize, right? And one of the tragic sort of conclusions I've come to is that I don't think that's the problem. I think that we don't have European elites. That is, people who think Europe as Europe and then look at what is going on, you know, in the streets of Athens, but also in the banks of Frankfurt, in terms of what Europe gets out of this. And that, you know, so one of the reasons why the intergovernmental, what was it called? The creeping into governmentalism. Now that everybody's creeping, it's like a Radiohead song, right? Is that the creeping into governmentalism? I find it's not creeping at all. It's blatant. The moment the financial crisis morphed into the sovereign debt crisis, the European moment was gone. And that was only a moment, really, if you think of it, that combined essentially the Commission and the ECB. The European moment was gone, and nobody's gone back to it at precisely the moment where you could argue that it would have been the strongest point. And I suspect one of the things that sort of, you know, I was thinking of the composition of the European Council. I don't think many of those people have actually ever lived outside the country where they are heads of state. I don't think they actually sort of fluently speak a second, leave alone a third language. I don't think they understand why, say, the Greeks or the Italians are opposed to particular kind of reforms as opposed to others. This doesn't mean that the Greeks or the Italians are right, or the others are wrong, or the other way around. It's just that there's no understanding of that kind of stuff because they don't live. And I don't think they're advised by the right type of people in that respect either. And that means that, to a large extent, this whole question of how do you sort of, you know, politically move Europe back up on the agenda, I don't think that's going to be very difficult because as far as I can tell, none of the member states of government have any interest or even interest both in terms of the cognitive, in cognitive terms and in material terms. There is no interest in doing that because they have no interest in it, right?
Thank you, Stuart.
I just want to challenge one of the very open remarks, which were that markets have become international, but our political institutions haven't. Can we just turn back history? In the 19th century, the private capital flows of money were enormous. There was an enormous political elite. You know, Byron came to Greece. You know, Goethe went on the Italian Rising. There was a political elite that actually was incredibly international. What has happened is that post-1945, we ended up in institutions with more, with the exception of the Balkans and the divided Germany, more or less national state structures within Europe which were functional. And then we ended up with, because we wanted to prevent Germany and France ever going to war again, a very desirable notion, that we thought that required the dismantling of the nation state. I just want us to go back a little bit in history. And then when the financial crisis occurred, we said, oh, hey, that is just further confirmation of that. What we need is supranational institutions. No, what we ended up with, WTO, all the IMF, all these organizations had not woken up that by the end of the 20th century and early of the 21st century, we ended up with enormous private capital flows, which we had not seen since the 19th century, which our post-World War II institutions were unable to control. And there was this wonderful moment when the Queen went to the Bank of England and the City, and she was surrounded by all these intelligent people.
That was at the Elysee.
Yeah, and she said, why did none of you see this coming? And the Elysee came back, and essentially what they said is, well, we all saw bits of it coming, but nobody managed to add it all up. And I think that's the danger ending up here. One little graph, and what I'm beginning to think is that we're full of these people who all understand bits of it, but actually nobody understands the whole of it, other than our voters, who are incredibly inarticulate, but I tell you, not stupid. And in the back of their minds they say, whatever this thing is, we don't like it. So,
Thank you. Following this, just as a further food for thought and as a contradictory remark of what you just said, recently, I think it was at the EUI, Professor Sánchez told a congregation of aspiring European students of various disciplines, he said this, if you really want, we can discuss various things, but if you really want to be at the cutting edge of research and contemplation, forget about the states. The states as a notion is something of the past. We have to think in different terms. Now, he didn't explain in great detail what these notions are, because precisely we are in a transitional phase, whether that means we go back further down in a regional level or not. But he was very much critical about the relevance of the nation state as we know it in the European context.
Two comments I want to make. The first one, it seems to me that Germany and Greece are about to have the same government, a grand coalition. I'm not joking. And that tells us something important and I believe positive. That the pro-European political forces have more in common than the anti-European forces. It's as difficult for Alternative for Germany to partner with Linke as it is for Syriza to partner with Anel or even was Golden Dawn. I mean, that's the reality of the situation. And come to think of it, it's natural. Because of the controversy that surrounds both creditor, the rescues in both creditor and debtor countries, the pro-European forces are losing, people at the edge. So we have the attempt for Germany basically making the liberals, forcing the German liberals into defeat, and in democracy losing people to the extreme right, and they're compelled to partner with the center-left parties, SPD and the PASOK in the Greek case. That's one point I want to make. The other thing is I want to disagree a little bit with Bob Hankin that the crisis has actually generated a tremendous amount of knowledge about Greece to the rest of Europe. I know this is the fact that the German Chancellor is fairly familiar with my mayor in Thessaloniki, and that's also that's a factor both for Greece and for the rest of Europe, because not only the rest of Europe gets to know us better, for better or worse, but we get to know ourselves better, and that's I believe it's a positive factor, because opacity was in Greece. It's partially intentional. Opacity has been used to conserve the pathologies of the system, and the transparency and the knowledge that the crisis creates is now a factor in the future evolution of the country.
Thank you very much. Question? Yes.
Okay, thank you. Just to elaborate further on what Bob Hanke said before, I think that there's not only a lack of European elite to drive the European project forward, I think there is a lack of a legitimate civil society to move things forward. For those who involve both Batman and Ward on the social capital in the US argue that something similar has happened in Europe, and something similar has happened at the level of EU affairs as well. So I was wondering whether there's a civil society right now in Europe that has a common sphere of understanding and exchanging views on what's going on right now. And going back to the argument of European Commission's nature or democracy or technocracy, I'm not really an expert on how the European Commission works, but I know that the comitology process has some interaction, some negotiation. I know that the member states have permanent representations in Brussels to negotiate. And I know that lately the European Commission has introduced a series of transparency publicity tools for people and journalists to watch some plenary sessions. So I was wondering whether we think that negotiation is part of democracy or not.
Thank you very much. Responses or further questions?
Just to follow up on the issue of negotiations, I think it very much depends on the basis of the negotiation. And as far as I can observe, the basis of the negotiation of the European Commission is basically already a final product. So they don't really put up a proposal and then they hear for everyone say good and then they come up with a document and then there's a second round. What they usually do is, this is what's going to happen, and this is soft law, so it's some of the European Commission's policy approach. And then there's some twisting and changing, but it's very minor. And that's why if you look at the number of instruments the European Commission is using, well, what they have done is they have forgotten about regulations completely, because it's very hard to pass them. They have now used directives as if they were regulations, because they're really, really prescriptive. And that's where the bulk of the negotiations take place, because member states know that their hands are going to be quite tight when they come to transposition, because the directives are becoming so prescriptive. And then really soft law is something the member states don't have time and resources to do with. That's where the European Commission is really biting into the member states' competencies in my view. And the second thing is the European Commission has now taken the habit of disliking the European Court of Justice's judgments and deciding to overrule them by means of soft law. So it's, well, this is only our interpretation of the case, but we read it differently than everybody else. And the member states don't really change that because they don't know how they're going to kind of implement that. So I think that Professor Cesar has been saying this for a while, but particularly in areas such as services and things like that, the policy is done in instruments that don't even really get negotiated. It's probably the transparency you mentioned, but that's one of the things.
Vasilius?
I'll be the last.
Okay.
The thing that I wanted to ask you, Albert, you talk about this software, you're talking again, like one of I may be entirely wrong in the way I understand it, okay, so correct me, but one of the things that I find intriguing about the sort of last few years is that go back 10 years ago, the open method of coordination was the key kind of, sort of arena and method in which, sort of member states and whatever the supranational level was, but usually the Commission would interact. Now, as far as I can tell, that exists on paper. There's a lot of bureaucrats running around shouting OMC and everything, but actually it doesn't show up anymore. So, which kind? I mean, I may be wrong about that, but if I'm right, what is the soft law type of model that you're referring to here?
Well, I think it may depend on policy area, but if you look at areas like competition or you look at areas like procurement, where you have now more and more is for instance, commission communication on the financing of services of general economic interest, and it has maybe 20 paragraphs, and that's where it's discussed. And then there's a staff working paper where the different options are detailed and the interpretation of those 20 paragraphs is laid down, which has 200 pages. And this is just prepared by someone in his desk in the Commission. And in the end, the point is that when you go trying to understand how they apply the 20 paragraphs, that the need of it is in the staff working paper, which is not even adopted by the Commission as an institution, it's just the staff working paper. And so by bringing down and down and down the level of decision making, they are avoiding the coordination and transparency and all the mechanisms. And I'm not sure if this happens everywhere else, but at least in the areas I know that's how it's happening.
Yeah, I mean, I just want to go back to the very opening thing where you said one of the aims of this was to have a greater distinction between politics and policy. And of course, the way all these negotiations go is a complete merging of policy and politics. So in a sense, you're already there where the European Union is heading. And I just want to make one observation as someone who spent years actually in these kind of discussions. The role of the national representatives, UPREP, as far as I'm concerned, is actually by far more powerful than the Prime Minister and the entire cabinet put together in terms of the deals they're striking. And in response to the requirement for openness, what I've noticed is that whenever you have found where power is, power just shifts. And one of the most important political deals ever struck actually were in the ladies' toilet, when the majority of health ministers actually were women. And we gathered in the Nuremberg and said, no, talk about this, are we? And all our officials had it on the agenda, and we just left afterwards. And they said, no, not really. And on the negotiations by the ladies.
Just if I can just come back on a couple of points. Points about the comitology issue. I do think this demonstrates absolutely completely why political and politicised and accountable leadership of the Commission is necessary. So you know where the buck stops. And I don't think it can be done through 28 different places in 28 different ways. I think at the end of the day, the way that you address the problem of unaccountable technocratic decision making is through politicised, democratic and accountable leadership, i.e. the College of Commissioners being much more accountable in a politicised way. I think that's the solution to that problem. Following on from that, coming back to Professor Dehousse, yeah, of course the electorate is ignorant, and of course what it's talked about. Alright, but the Brussels bubble discussion is completely different from the one we're going to have now. Of course it is. Indeed, I think what's happening now is a fascinating learning process by party leaders. Party leaders are actually learning what their member states signed up to in the Lisbon Treaty. The Lisbon Treaty is very clear. The President of the European Commission will be elected on the basis of a nomination by the European Council to reflect the outcome of an election. And that's, I know, but it's never been there before. And it does take us into a whole new territory, which potentially takes us towards a personalised, politicised campaign where you could have debates between parties and between party candidates for high office, which we've not had before. So I think there are possibilities to see 2014 as being different from what went before. But I agree with this. I share the scepticism. But I do think it opens possibilities and opportunities.
Versus EU technocrats. I mean, this is an age-old debate, both in political science, but also in current affairs. It seems to me that things haven't really changed all that much. That's the way Europe has been progressing, and I think the EU is most effective when it is least visible, when it's seen to have the least impact on our daily lives, and it's clearly not the case nowadays. Because of the crisis, people want answers right now, and clearly they don't seem to get them from their elected MEPs, from their representatives in the European institutions, and so on. And this is why nation states and heads of government have taken over and have tried to basically reset the new terms of the agreements. I mean, Europe is basically an evolving contract, right? And it has to be constantly renegotiated, rehashed, has to be redefined, and in different ways. And that's the effect of a crisis on Europe and on the process of European integration. When a crisis breaks over, then basically that's when nation states take over and redesign and redefine the terms of this contract. And that's when, that's the whole idea of creeping into governmentalism, which eventually gives way to creeping supranationalism. And I think I very much agree with Professor Dehousse on this point. So, what's going to be left over once the crisis is over, at least in nominal terms, right? In terms of going back to positive growth levels, we're still going to have a stronger Commission, a stronger European Parliament, stronger institutions. And I think that's something that we need to sort of be more aware of. So in that sense, yeah, I mean, of course we need more direct democracy, but that's the way that the current sort of indirectly democratic model has been working, and there has been a lot of progress since the EU was founded. So yeah, guess that's my point. So thanks.
Everybody, my name is Pano. I live here locally now. European integration, talking about it, and we all say about this big Europe. Hungary, everybody said the way is a Dutch. How does that integrate us into Europe? If we all say we have a national identity, and in the last few years with the crisis, as a Greek, I feel that I've been singled out. I feel that the European Union said to me, I am to be blamed for the crisis. Do they want us to be integrated really? I don't think so. If European Union was a football team and they were keeping me always on the bench, I wasn't going to be part of the team. What do you think about that?
That's a very interesting question. The question is, if you are injured, you wouldn't be able to play. That would be the one answer. But this is a very good point that brings into the discussion the notion of national identity, which for the last couple of centuries, of course, we link it, particularly in Europe, with the notion of the state. The question is, to what extent, in the modern sort of context and the needs that sort of overlap has to be revisited or recalibrated somehow. And this is, I think, part of the question that we are trying to address today. Vasilis.
Thank you very much. Two different points. The first one is for a question actually for David. Because you said that your presentation, which I personally very much enjoyed, is in a sense complementary to what Renaud said. But for them to be complementary, there is a precondition that Europhobia generated by the crisis, and maybe beyond the crisis, before the crisis, will be an obstacle to further parliamentarization. Because what you described, to my understanding, is the normal procedure. This is what has always been happening. Lisbon, it was negotiated before the crisis. Since the 70s, that the European Parliament is always increasing, getting more and more power. So, my big question mark here is whether the Europhobia, and I very much like that term, generated by the crisis, will not put an end, but will hinder that process. And then the second question, just to echo what Antigone was saying and the debate you had with Albert and the remark here, I don't think that is a question of national sovereignty. If there is something we should worry about, this is popular sovereignty. It is not that national sovereignty has been given by Greece to Brussels, to Merkel, etc., etc. It was given, yes, of course, this is European integration. It was done by a democratically elected government. This is what it always happened. I mean, from the perspective of international law, this is a question of trust on powers. This is the way things happen. This is the normal pathway, let's say. My problem, and this leads to what Aldi was saying, is the way it was done. And this is not a question of national sovereignty, but of popular sovereignty. How do we make those decisions? And I'm not one of the persons who are, don't take me wrong, I mean, I'm not against the memorandum, etc. But you mentioned how many, 300 pages, the software instrument? Well, something like that is, that heavy, that lengthy is also the memorandum. And this passed the second one from the Greek Parliament with one single article. Are you in favor, yes or no? Who drafted this as being mentioned? It is not, I'm not against the result. This is something different. What I'm questioning here is what is the procedure we follow? And the whole debate about European integration and direct democracy, should it be more direct, etc., is based upon one presumption. And the presumption is that the member states are democratic. Well, this crisis reveals that maybe we were over-optimistic about that. It reveals the systemic deficiencies in terms of democratic deficit within the member state. And I don't think this is only Greek. This is Italian, this is Portuguese, this is Spanish, and this is Belgian, this is maybe not German. Thank you.
And I think a last question from Professor Dehousse.
I just wanted to cover very briefly a few points that have been
emerging in the discussion as a follow-up to the presentation you heard. By the way, David, you're right, absolutely. Next time, we should definitely be first. It would be much clearer for everybody. And much simpler for myself, incidentally. But the point I wanted to make first is the following. Let's assume basically that indeed things happen the way you described. What emerges quite strongly from this discussion is that it will have implications the day after for the way the European, should I say, political system or policy-making system, I'm not sure, let's say policy-making because I think it's closer to what I have in mind, will eventually work. Why? Well, first, look at the Commission. Think of what the Commission is supposed to do in a EU setting. Is a politicized, or will a politicized European Commission be in a position to act effectively, pursuing the objectives of its traditional competition policy? Will its neutrality not be called into question by it being a political actor? Will the Commission be able to become the, let's say, ultimate telecoms regulator, as it ultimately proposed last week, or was it this week, I don't recall? Will it be still credible as a guardian of the treaties, which is one of its standard missions, if it's a politicized body? Just a few questions. Moving on to the European Parliament. Fine, we will have a stable majority. Will the Parliament be better off? I mean, if we are to move towards a parliamentary model, we should ask ourselves, how does it work in parliamentary systems? Are parliaments really the strong elements in their relationship with the executive? Or is the fact that there is to be necessarily support from the parliament for the proposals stemming from the executive eventually an element that will have a detrimental effect on the quality of parliamentary control over what the executive does? You see, what I have in mind is this idea that if we are exploring this politicization avenue, then we must think of the consequences of all this for the way policy making is done. And I suspect going in this direction in a positive way, as I say, would require a radical transformation of the powers entrusted to the European Union, first, the Commission, second, but ultimately also it will force a major reform of EU policy making by, I guess, creating an antitrust, an independent antitrust authority or something of that kind. Is this something we want? Is this something that the Commission is prepared to face? Did they address that issue when they drafted their recommendation? I wonder. Second point, present in a number of statements that were made was the question of what will be left of the nation states if this happens. I wouldn't worry for the nation states. I mean, in a way, one could describe much of what has been taking place recently in the wake of the crisis in a mid-modern way, that is to say, trying to show that in a way the states acting together at the European level have done what was required to rescue them. As back in the 1950s, they invented this thing called the European Community in order to develop their own welfare system. And basically, what is at stake is can they protect what is the basis of the European model, we are told. And of course, there are costs attached to that, but it's not that they disappeared altogether. Even if, as I argue, at the end of the day, supranational institutions will, in all likelihood, emerge stronger. I just don't think that the political system will lose any connection whatsoever with national reality. It simply won't happen. I mean, if we assume that supranationalism means many people seem to assume rather that supranational means something like the development of a superstate on a European plane. It's not likely to happen. I think that there will remain quite powerful links with the national setting. Which brings me to a final point in the form of a question. Yes, you're right. Negotiations and their role in democracy is an important issue. It's an important issue in any not merely at the EU level. We're used to negotiations between nation states. Following David's presentation, I would say maybe we now will have to face another type of emerging negotiation model, which is negotiation between European parties. But be assured, there will still take place behind closed doors.
Just two ideas. One idea that I thought was quite interesting is that the debate in Europe evolving from anti-Europe, pro-Europe to within the pro-Europe parties and groups, different options about Europe, sometimes very oversimplified, like anti-Merkel or pro-Merkel or the North-South divide, but they are becoming quite real in the national discussions. This divide in different options for Europe within groups that are not anti-Europe, although anti-Europeanism is growing as well. Another idea about the soft law and it's really strange because the soft law is really putting very strong boundaries in a lot of things that states can and can't do. And in a lot of cases there is, of course, a problem of democracy and how these decisions are taken. But apart from that, there is also a restriction in the flexibility of government countries with different laws, with different regulations, with different settings, which is quite schizophrenic when you think about the pressures that the European Union or the European Commission poses on reforming to simplify, to make things more flexible and work better. And then in a lot of cases when you try to get to solutions, you are shocking with a lot of very strange regulations, or at least blurred regulations that you never know that any solution to this kind of problems is going to pass these regulations. And this is quite a problem. There should be a strong movement in Europe towards simplification of the law, because the lots of years that brought us till now have brought a lot of complications, and a lot of them not deeply discussed. And it is a problem of democracy, but it's also a problem of functioning the states. Okay.
Other interventions? Yes, Albert?
Just a very quick reaction. I think this is a key point. I think that the best law should only have like one rule, but then you have to trust whoever enforces it is capable and someone looks at what they're doing. And I think that one of the problems with the crisis is there is a massive distrust in any check and balance that we have in the banking system. That's why the European Commission is just going into very tiny detail of what member states can do, because that's what they can control. If you leave the member states leeway for them to experiment and try to change things in terms of ECP, the problem is a lot of capable people looking at what they're doing, what the effects are going to be, and taking this crystal ball and trying to see what the implications are going to be. The European Commission is also very limited in what they can do. So I think that's why they are so rules-based, and that's the way they're trying to govern the reaction to the crisis. So maybe we should even take one step back and it's, well, do one more euro, then who's already running it? Do we have the manpower to do it? Or do we have, not even a civil society, do we have a body of people working at institutions capable of doing it? Do we have the money and the resources to invest in it? And then maybe we can start discussing other things. I think it's a very good point.
Yeah, I wanted to just come back to what a little bit what Vassilis was saying about, and I guess some of us have been saying is that after all we could have just like the empty chair crisis of the ECJ, that's more integration, we're going to have that now as well. then I'm not so sure that I'm going to be pro-European. Because what I see right now and what is going on in policy is something I don't particularly like. I'm not, I believe in anti-cyclical spending, and that's not what the EU is doing right now. That's not what the member states are doing right now. But, so then I say, well, then maybe we should stop this pro-cyclical time. But we're also kind of are discussing, I think I'm not the only one that has these kind of concerns. So, although I'm not so optimistic about politicization, I think it's essential because this is about what Europe do we want, and I don't want elites to just muddle through at the end, and we're going to see some form of policy coming out that, you know, majority of European, or at least an equal share of Europeans will perhaps have very different views about how to solve financial crises, are being left out. So I think this is very important to think about it. I'm not so sure that the politicization of EP elections is going to solve that issue, and that there's a lot of stuff that needs to be done. But I think it's I wouldn't be wanting to see, you know, a muddling through without any map or without any roadmap, where at the end we're going to end up in a union that some people may not want to live in.
Yes.
Yeah, I have to comment. One is for the whole idea about the politicization of the EU. I don't see it necessarily as a very in a very optimistic way. The reason being that I think that they use more like the economy, right? I mean, it's the news when it's bad, it's never the news when it's good. And I cannot perceive a European electorate that's going to sort of mobilize in favor of the EU. If not anything else, because the elites, to the extent that they politicize the issue, they do it in the opposite way, and it's quite obvious why that's the case. It's like, it takes a lot more degrees of freedom to explain why something is good rather than just say that something is bad, and that's what's happening in most national party competition sort of settings. And I also have a question about David. I have been asking this question to various people, MEPs themselves. I haven't gotten a sort of very convincing answer thus far, and I think you're probably the most radical person to give such an answer. To what do they feel accountable? Is it a party line? Is it a national line? And to what extent has the crisis changed that, if so, to any degree? It's a genuine question that I always ask.
Shall I come back to the specific question at the end first? Statistically, it's very clear that members of the European Parliament vote according to party, statistically. And the work of Simon Hicks et al. Demonstrates that very clearly, that 90% of votes are cohesive party votes, and nationality is far less relevant. However, I am probably the first person, I think, on record, always to criticise Simon Hicks and the data, because there's more to it than just the statistics. You have to look into the details of each particular vote, because more often than not, what you get within the party is a national-based negotiation. So British Labour with German SPD with French Socialists will negotiate the thing on which there is a vote subsequently. So it's not good enough just to look at Simon Hicks data. You've got to get deeper than that and look at what it is that's actually being voted on and what are the compromises which have been made prior to the vote. And this is the big problem of looking at European Parliament voting behaviour. There are something like 20,000 votes of the European Parliament which have been studied empirically. And yet, you're only seeing a third of the votes in the European Parliament as well. So there are big questions about looking only at voting behaviour. Just go back to some of this idea of the politicised commission for a minute. Absolutely. And if you look at my first slide, the title of my presentation, I used the word revolution. I agree that should this happen to any great extent, and you, Professor Dehousse, used the word radical, this is radical revolutionary change. Absolutely. And I'm the first to admit that it might all be a flop, and it might not be as perfectly formed as I presented it. If it does go anything like in that direction, we will see next year a very different European Union start to be constructed from the one that we had before. That's all that I would posit. And I think, despite the skepticism over European elections and what European elections normally add up to, I think that you can see the beginnings of something different in the way that the 2014 election and subsequent coalition formation will play out. Give me one more minute. I think there's a question that can be asked about the interdependence of national economies and about what happens if the outcome is different from the way it can be presented. National economies are today interdependent in a way that they weren't previously. There's an argument going on in Britain at the moment about a train line. And I'm sorry, I don't know where you are on HS2.
You're Birmingham and you're for it.
You're for it, okay. It's a train line from the south of England to the north-west of England. And in all of the coverage of that discussion, there, at least as I see it in British media, there is hardly any discussion about the importance of that train line for connecting the periphery of the European Union to the centre of the European Union. It's an entirely national discussion. And yet, in fact, the value of that train line is not about the national economy, it's about the European economy. I'm glad we agree on that. I mean, there is no way that train line is of value only in England, and it is an English train line. So we need to look at these issues in a much more Europeanised kind of way. And I think the integration of the European economy requires, therefore, a more politicised system of governance. Hence, the importance of being right in my presentation about 2014. Going back to your comment, if I'm not right, and if nothing like that happens, then we're going to have a very miserable European Union for the next 20, 30 years. And we go back into a period not only of Europhobia, but a period of Eurosclerosis. And I think that's a very bad future, which I think we should all be aware of. That in a way, the crisis of legitimacy of the European Union can be put right in the immediate future. If it's not, then we're going to have quite a miserable future, I think. Sorry to end on a very negative note.
Any other questions or observations before the break, before lunch? Okay, I think I would like to thank the panelists for the first very interesting part of the discussion, and we reconvene at what time? At 2 or 2 o'clock.